be used for the press release and for the purposes of the dissemination. Dear Steve, now the floor is yours, and could you please share with us your insights on the different factors that have influenced the position of African countries on the Russia war in Ukraine, including those historical ties, economic interest, and political affiliations? The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Kiri. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got a short PowerPoint, so hopefully you can see that. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, let me just move this window. And I know that can you hear me?
Yes, everything is good.
Okay, thank you. So I thought to open with this picture where we can see a very happy and smiling Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, with the South African Minister of International Relations and Cooperation when he was here earlier in the year. And I think it speaks of a warm relationship between the two countries. You know, it's important when looking at Southern Africa in particular to recognize that the governing parties in most Southern African countries were liberation movements that fought colonialism and white settler rule, and they received money, weapons, training, and moral support from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, so the USSR. Of course, after 1989, and especially after 1991, Russia turned inward and reduced its diplomatic presence on the continent, as well as its business interests as it became more inward-looking. But I think there is today a romantic nostalgia among many African governments for the USSR and its place in the world. What we've seen under President Putin since the 2000s, and buoyed by good oil prices, has been a re-engagement in Africa. And we saw accelerations of this interaction increase after certain conflicts happened in the former Soviet Union space. So after the Georgia war in 2008, after Crimea in 2014, and when Russia was under sanction, it looked for new markets. And Africa was one of the places that it sought those new markets. A high point of this was the Russia-Africa summit that was held in 2019, where 43 African heads of state attended. And there's a lot of interest looking towards the next summit in St. Petersburg at the end of July. But it's not all about trade. If we look at Russia's trade volumes with Africa, its exports to Africa are only $15 billion compared to $116 billion for China. And combined, the European Union is nearly $170 billion. Negligible imports, and its total trade volume is about $17 billion, which is dwarfed by China and by the European Union as well. And it's only half of the trade that the US does with Africa. So the relationship is about something more than just trade. I think what's important is to outline Russia's narrative and the way it's been playing out in Africa. Russia really pushes the line that this war with Ukraine is all about the encroachment of NATO and the encirclement of Russia. That Russia believes in a multipolar, not a unipolar world, and certainly not a unipolar world that is dominated by the United States. That Russia presents alternative values and traditional values. Much is made of Western hypocrisy, that when the West invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and Serbia and Libya, there was not the same pattern of international outcry, and therefore, well, you know, why is what Russia's doing any different? It's quick to impute regime change motives to Western powers. And I think somebody has described the era that we're in at the moment as post-truth, where everything is relative, where there's your version and our version. And there is no objective truth out there. And I think Russia's disinformation campaigns seek to make everything relative. I think also what didn't help at all in terms of African attitudes was the racism that we saw against African refugees or people who were trying to leave Ukraine. And it fed into this narrative that this is a Nazi state in Kiev and that Moscow is trying to rid Europe of Nazism just as it did in 1945. But there is a strong resonance of Russia's narrative among some African leaders and populations. And I'm sure Ray will talk about the survey that the Brenthurst Foundation has done, which shows sometimes the difference between what leaders think and what populations think. How does Russia cooperate or collaborate with Africa? It's generally low volume but high impact. It makes a lot of noise about non-interference in internal affairs and providing diplomatic support. And as I said, it taps into the anti-colonialist and anti-Western sentiment that is sometimes just below the surface, if not on the surface. We're looking at soft power today. The tools of soft power include the Orthodox religion, narratives and the media, use of channels like RT, Russia Today, and Sputnik, social media, cyber warfare. And I think it's fair to say that this has been a hybrid conflict that's both taking place on the battlefield in Ukraine, but also on the screens and on the phones of people all around the world. And a lot of effort is going in from the Russian side to portray its narrative, its version of things. Russia often likes to operate in the shadows and thrives on chaos. We've seen the actions of private military companies like the Wagner Group operating on the continent. And often there are these high-level visits and signing of declarations, but it has been noted by observers that not many get implemented in full, that they're long on promises and short on delivery. And a lot of the discussion is that Africa wants to avoid being pawns in somebody else's chess game. It doesn't want to be seen as a terrain for a new Cold War, but it wants to assert its own agency, its own ability to act and make choices. So I'm going to not go into any great detail, but as you know, we've seen many votes at the UN General Assembly on the Ukraine issue. And as Giedrich said, Africa has been basically split down the middle with those supporting condemnation of Russia and those abstaining. So this was the first vote in March 2022. This one was a little different. It was on the suspension of Russia from the Human Rights Council, where many more African countries opposed that, and there were more. There was a high percentage of abstentions as well. What we are seeing is many countries in Africa and in other parts of the world, like Brazil and India, not wanting to be in one camp or the other, and so the idea of non-alignment is being revived. What's important to note is that no African country has to date imposed any sanctions on Russia, and have views shifted with all the Russian attention to Africa. One area where we can point to is Mali, which moved from abstaining into voting with Russia at the UN General Assembly of late. South Africa's position is often called active non-alignment or strategic non-alignment. South Africa says it favors dialogue and peace, but there's been confusion over its stance, and it's moved to blame Russia and seems to be closer to Russia than it is to the West. We've seen this through Lavrov's visits to Africa and to South Africa as well as the Operation Mosey 2, which took place on the anniversary of the invasion. It was a military drills that were held in conjunction with Russia and China in February this year. And we've had a number of ships and planes that seem to land mysteriously in South Africa and offload their cargo or unload their cargo in secret. I'm going to skip through this. Obviously, the economic effects of the war on Africa are well known. Oil prices were rising, fertilizer shortages, food shortages, inflation, investment and currency volatility, this disruption of food, particularly the mining of the Black Sea, a growing cost of living, which I think has been shared by citizens around the world and has led to instability. This scenario has exacerbated the effects of the COVID pandemic, but perhaps one silver lining is that African countries are trying to take advantage of selling oil and gas to Europe, which is no longer sourcing that from Russia. Just very quickly mention some important moments in diplomacy. We saw the president of Senegal and the head of the African Union at the time, Macky Sall, and the chairman of the Commission of the African Union go to Moscow in June 2022. And this built momentum for the Turkish UN-mediated agreement, the Black Sea Grain Agreement initiative, which has had its problems, but I think is one of the few bright spots in this war. We also had, for example, President Zelensky speaking to the African Union in an online discussion in June 2022, but there was hardly any interest from African heads of state, and that event was poorly attended. We've seen things like the South African Defense Minister visiting Moscow for a military conference, and this creates difficulty for South Africa presenting itself as neutral. And then we also saw the Ukrainian foreign minister with planned visits to West and East African countries, but he had to cut that visit short because of developments in the war, and I've already mentioned Lavrov. So finally, and I'm probably coming close to my time, what we have seen is divided African positions. Many have, over time, over the last year, become less outspoken against Russia and leaning towards Russia, even if they say they are neutral. It's clear to me that the future of the international system is at play if states can violate the sovereignty of their neighbors without consequences. That puts the entire system in jeopardy. But all these visits that we've seen to Africa by diplomats from the West and from Russia and China hasn't really shifted attitudes all that much, with the exception of, say, a country like Mali. Many Africans will say that our own conflicts, climate change, COVID, are more important than this European war happening far from our shores. But the economic and diplomatic effects, I think, have been quite profound. And finally, as I said earlier, this is as much a war of communications and perception and language as it is a war on the ground. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't rush through that too quickly.
Thank you very much, Steve, for the very comprehensive presentation. And since the topic is complex and the time is limited, I think you've done a perfect job to set the ground for the further discussion and the other speakers' presentation. What I take from your presentation, and we can come back later after everyone speaks in a second round of our interventions, is that probably the conclusion can be made that pragmatism or the pragmatical reasons are not the main ones, not the main factors behind the, so to say, supportive position of some African states, and the sentiment is very much important. And here I have just a question on my mind for the later. How about the multiple narratives? It's clear that the Russian part does the effort to drive a narrative for their own sake, but who forms the narrative and who are the actors of forming the Western, so to say, pro-Western or pro-Ukraine narrative? And here I want to actually come to the next presentation and next presenter, Mr. Ray Hartley. Please, could you give us share your insights on the sentiments or the position of the nations, and especially in South Africa Republic, and you've together with the colleagues have some data, and we are very, very excited to hear it from you about it. Please take your floor.
Thank you very much. I think, Stephen, you did a very excellent job in your presentation, and I think you've covered most of the ground really well, and I'm going to avoid repeating what you've said and try and just pick on a few what I hope are reasonably original insights. I think it's quite interesting, if you look at the map of African countries that, the way they voted in the UN, that there is a very clear divide. What you see is that the largest economies on the continent and the countries that have tended more to embrace democracy and openness have tended to vote in favor of these resolutions condemning the Russian invasion. So if you look at the sort of diamond on the African map, I like to think of the diamond: South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Kenya. 3 of the 4 points of that diamond have consistently voted in favor of these resolutions. And South Africa has been somewhat of a strange outlier, really, given that it is part of the democratic grouping of nations in Africa, and is very economically integrated into into world trade, and yet has abstained and has in fact hinted strongly by its actions that it may be partial to Russia. So the question is, why has South Africa taken that point of view? How has South Africa ended up there? I think part of it is separating what is the justification from what's really going on. I think the justification of the links to the old Soviet Union and its support of the anti-apartheid struggle, which was very real, very material, and on a fairly large scale, is what is sometimes offered. You know, we're an old friend of Russia, I think is the phrase that's used. But I think the reality of it is that it is a very different Russia today than it was then. And it's a very different South Africa today than it was then. And in any event, a lot of the struggle era associations were with Ukraine. So some of the first big groups of MK exiles, Mkhonto weSizwe exiles that went for military training were trained in Odessa and elsewhere in Ukraine, and have a strong historical link with that region. So the question is, what's really going on? And I suspect part of it is that South Africa is undergoing a lot of difficulties economically. We have very limited growth. There is very high unemployment. Things look like they're getting worse. Our currency is deteriorating very quickly against the dollar. And the need to sort of try and look to the world stage or grasp for some kind of relevance on the world stage and to look externally is there. And I think that projecting ourselves as a part of this new alignment of countries led by BRICS that is challenging this unipolar world led by NATO, as they would put it, offers this opportunity. And I think the same thing applies to solidarity with other struggles around the world, which we spend a lot of rhetoric and a lot of time on. I think also there is the question of who is really influencing South Africa. Is it Russia or is it China? So South Africa, I think, really got lucky by being admitted to the BRICS group of countries. You know, in terms of GDP and a whole lot of other factors, it's a lot smaller than the other countries. And now that it's in there, I think it sees that as being a way to project itself forward as part of this new pole that challenges this unipolar world. And I think China is really the country that South Africa probably looks most to for political direction. China has massive trade with South Africa. The balance of trade is very much in China's favor, unlike with a lot of its other trading partners in Europe and elsewhere. But there is huge trade. And I think that there is this kind of closeness with China. I mean, I think, state visits and some of the first state visits and so on. And then Russia, I think, is seen as sort of China and Russia are together in this. And then there's the final question, which is that there are quite substantial Russian funders of the ruling party in South Africa. So there's an oligarch called Victor Vekselberg. He's part of a manganese company, a fairly large one in South Africa, and is the single biggest donor to the ruling party, the ANC. And these donations are known because they're now required to be made public. And it's pretty clear that the ANC stands to lose a lot if it displeases Russia, Russia could easily punish it by stopping those donations, and money is very short for the ANC at the moment. So I'll just leave it at that, and hope to deal with more in questions.
Thank you, Ray, very much for the original insights, as you say, because we are really here to know more about and understand more South Africa, especially position, and you really hint some important aspects. But I will not let you go before you tell us a little bit about nations' sentiments or position that you
Yes.
learned from the surveys you've made.
Yeah, no, we conducted a survey of South Africans. We were actually doing a sort of pre-election look at opinions, and we decided to also ask them the question. And the question was, you know, do you agree that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an act of aggression that should be condemned? And we were quite astonished when 74.3% of respondents agreed. So even if there is some factor of that's got to be taken into account, variance, statistical variance due to the survey, it's certainly a large majority of South Africans. And what we then did, because we also did a voter survey in Zimbabwe, and we thought, well, let's ask the same question. And we were again quite surprised to find that even in Zimbabwe, 58% of the of voters said that they thought that the Russian invasion should be condemned and was an act of aggression. So I think there's this disjuncture between the ruling parties and the people in these countries, and very much more pronounced in South Africa. And it speaks to, I think, a disconnection between the youth and this narrative of the historical association with Russia. So most of the population actually was born after that association took place during the struggle years, and doesn't have a direct memory of that relationship, and therefore doesn't, it's not a factor for them. And I think also people have been raised in a free, open country with regular elections, and it's an open, accountable democracy. And they can see that that's at odds with the Russian political model.
Okay, thank you, Ray, once again for this insightful presentation. And we are actually looking forward for the discussion. I believe people present here have many thoughts or questions to share. Myself, I take from your presentation that there is this, as you say, split, and it will have some consequences sooner or later. But for me, I think it's very important to know that there is this linkage to historical background, or as I always tell my students and teach them to look back into the history of colonialism, and you will find a lot of explanation of what is happening today. So it's very important for us also to hear from you, from the experts of the country's politics, that really the Soviet Union era is still relevant in a way and still has an effect through the direct politics. So different polls and different surveys took place, and I know that also Lucas Ivanauskas and his colleagues from Africa also tried to look at the narratives, different narratives on the social media, and there are some conclusions to share and draw. So I will give a floor to Lucas, and we are looking forward to hear what you found out and what kind of insights you can suggest.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm from Africa, which is a Baltic think and do tank. So we are a civil society organization that connects and reflects partnerships between the Baltics and Africa since 2015. So it means that we are not neutral. We are an active participator within this action making. So our two ideological things that might concern our work is first that we are want to talk, and we want to talk from the spirit of partnership making. And we have been doing this even before it became cool on EU, on the US, on other global levels. Another thing that we are a bold organization. So when I will not say about Lithuania, I will talk about the Baltic region. So after the Russia's unprovoked invasion in Ukraine, we wanted to contribute to steering an informed conversation on Russia's aggression against Ukraine with our African counterparts, especially from civil society, media, and academia, and propose suggestions for joint actions. And we started from a mini research as our departure point. From February to March 2022, we collected and analyzed more than 100 messages, ranging from African experts to civil society opinions on various media platforms. Our aim was to identify the most popular narratives circulating in public discourse in the early phases of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and share our reflections from the Baltic perspective. We didn't have an ambition to cover the full spectrum of different positions circulating within African public sphere. Instead, we picked the top 3 most popular yet problematic narratives and aimed to provide a balanced response from our historical and political experience. The first narrative that we identified as problematic and quite popular from our sample is that Russia never colonized Africa. Let me quote one tweet from civil society activists from Southern Africa. Russia has been a good friend to Africa. Russia never colonized Africa. Russia never murdered a single African head of state. The Russians never imposed their language on us, but Russia support our struggle for independence, and it's turned the favor. It's to turn the favor. Baltics has an interesting story to tell to our African partners in order to debunk the misleading image of Russia as non-colonial, non-repressive power, as the perceptions of Russia or successor of Soviet Union as non-colonial power contradicts the reality of nations that live directly under Soviet rule. I saw that we have Professor Valdas Sirutavičius, who did a great job in writing study on the first years of reoccupation, so we could share maybe his own ideas to what extent we can write or talk about this parallels between African countries, liberation movements, colonization, and our own experience under Soviet control. But besides that, we have current experience of working with Russian disinformation and misinformation nationally on Eastern Partnership regions. For example, we have a Lithuanian NGO Debunk EU that working on this subject, so we could share our own expertise with Africa partners from civil society, public sector, academics, journalists, and also on the EU-Africa policy level on this EU framework, because EU says now that they want to strategically work with the strategic communication with our African partners. Another problematic narrative that we found is that US, NATO, West is behind this Russia-Ukraine war. For example, one social media influencer from Southern Africa tweeted USA is using Ukraine as a proxy to fight Russia. On the one hand, this narrative is a paradox. While African leaders and societies have been persistently and rightfully claiming for recognition of the agency, we see this in US-Africa strategy, that agency is the first thing that US want to appeal to African partners in order to build or rebuild trust and connections with African counterparts. Yes, this agency has been taken away when African people from social media were talking about Ukraine or even our own region of Central and Eastern Europe. On the other hand, this paradox is not so unfamiliar within the Baltic context. Although we don't want to be treated as a zone of influence of great powers, for example, Russia, There is clear tendency to talk about African countries in media, in academia, within other platforms in terms of influence on zones of Russia, China, US, without taking into account the African agency itself. So this paradox, this narrative identifies our common ground that of understanding the world order that should be, as we think, without the playgrounds between great powers. And third narrative that I want to talk is about whataboutism. What about Libya? What about Ethiopia? What about Eritrea? You name any African conflict that comes to your mind. For example, let me quote a policy center based in the Horn of Africa, who said in their public communication, who gave NATO permission to remove Libya's Gaddafi? Africa has suffered enough unilateral sanctions against UN members like Eritrea. In Baltics, we must admit that we have not taken seriously into account security concerns beyond our close neighborhood, yet previous passivity and lack of engagement are not solid argument to leave Ukraine deprived of solidarity and support when fundamental international rules have been brutally violated. The global implications of Russia's aggression against Ukraine proved the necessity not only to stir the dialogue with our African partners on topics like global security architecture, food security, global supply chain, but also better understand silent issues and concerns of African partners. And Ukraine's efforts to reach out to African partners directly show the importance of bridging the mental gaps between realities of our region and African partners. Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Kuleba, visit African countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Ghana in 2022 autumn. That was said with very clear message that Ukraine wants to build new quality partnership based on mutual respect, support, and benefits. And after this visit, during UN General Assembly voting to condemn Russian annexation in Ukraine, two African countries, Senegal and Angola, changed their votes for sustaining in favor of the resolutions. To increase mutual understanding between Baltic and African regions, we, Africa, organized a public discussion in EU-Africa agenda on the EU-Africa agenda in connection to Russia's invasion in Ukraine in Brussels, together with experts, academics, diplomats from Baltic, Poland, European Commission, Ukraine, and Kenya in September 2022. Besides this event, we have been taking efforts to let Lithuanian audience to hear African voices by translating Kenyan expert Dr. Hassan Kaneja article to Lithuanian, where he was trying to explain why Africans were surprised of the surprise of the Westerners, how Africans acted on this context of Russia's aggression on Ukraine. We also translated the iconic speech of Kenyan Ambassador to UN Security Council, Martin Kimani, where he warned Russia to respect its border with Ukraine using Africa's colonial past to highlight the dangers of stoking the embers of dead empires. So we have not only those who are neutral or more forward to Russia, but also we have African partners who are more in favor of Ukraine, the supporters of Ukraine. And this speech and this example of Kenya shows that there's different variety of countries' position. On the state level, this Lithuania government can be strategic and vocal on the needs of creating mutual beneficial partnership with African countries on political, economic, development cooperation levels like never before. And after this invasion, Minister of Foreign Affairs Gabrielius Landsbergis urged the need to work with African partners to increase solidarity towards Ukraine during his speech at annual gathering of Lithuanian diplomats last year. So our next speaker could comment more how these words are coming to the reality, because Baltic historical experience of being under Russian control for a few centuries and that expertise in region enable us to share more contextual knowledge with our partners directly without this burden of colonial or other story burden that comes from our Western partners when they are trying to talk with African partners. And this absence of previous engagements give us a chance to invite a genuine dialogue on Russia's aggression against Ukraine with our African partners. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Lucas. I'm very impressed with all our speakers. Are just are so good at timing that my job is so easy. I want to highlight that we are really happy that we have such as civil society organizations like Africo, and especially with the activist and analyst of a PhD rank, so to say, in philosophy, and also in a strong background of political science. So as we heard, there are interesting findings from a narrative analysis, and there are some activities done. And in cooperation with the government of Lithuania, there are some efforts and some attention to the continent and understanding the scope of our country and our limits of human resources. We have, as you know, one embassy only in sub-Saharan region. This is the South Africa Republic for multiple reasons. And here is the representative of the embassy, the head of the diplomatic mission, but also many of the colleagues are of diplomatic community are also here as a participant. So before heading to the next speaker, Mr. Ambassador, I would like to welcome again all the participants who joined also later, and say that the meeting is recorded for the users of dissemination later. And dear Ambassador, thank you for your patience, for waiting for your turn, and I will give a floor to you, asking about your perception, about the perception from your position on what is going on in South Africa Republic, in the continent, if you could, and also about the mission of yours, since the war has started last year in Ukraine, and what was done, and what are the aims of your mission? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introduction and guiding. So it's difficult to speak in the fourth place, but therefore I will start by quoting breaking news, which I just read on the News 24, that U.S. ambassador says South Africa gave weapons, ammunition to Russia for Ukraine war. That means that mystery of that warship, which was docked in Simonstown military port, is solved. Now we know what at least U.S. believes, that the ammunition was loaded on Russian ship. So now I will turn to my prepared notes. And I wanted to start with saying that Russia's relations with South Africa could have taken a different turn, because at one time when Soviet Union collapsed and Russia had, under Yeltsin, Russia had lost the interest in South Africa. Later on, relations gradually warmed up, and the hottest love flared up under President Zuma from around 2010. And today, it's not surprising for me that his daughter now runs the Twitter Russia and Putin support campaign. So in the current situation is that the relations between Russia and South Africa are based on ideology rather than on economic logic or the rule of international law. Although, given the problems of corruption in the country, top echelons, I would not rule out the possibility that vested interests of a major influence. In other words, as unpleasant as it is to say, foreign policy, like domestic policy, can be corrupt. We remember the encouraging first year statement on the war started by Russia, which said that Russia must withdraw its troops. So now the current position is completely pro-Russian. One has to accept the fact that the final foreign policy decisions on this issue are not taken by DIRCO, but the ANC or the union building. As has been pointed out, there are political forces and sections of society that take completely different position from the ANC. The Democratic Alliance's position is well known. We know that the leader of the party visited Ukraine maybe once. The leaders of the Southern Cape have said that the Russian warship is not welcome here, and so on. There is an Inkatha Freedom Party who takes also a pro-Western view. There's a lot of criticism of the current foreign policy in the press. And as I mentioned, three quarters of respondents condemned the Russian aggression. But for South Africa's foreign policy to change, these forces must come to power. Now, nobody has been able to change the South African position so far, and I have no doubt that nobody will change it in near future, unless something very, very fundamental happens. We have seen very intensive US efforts to intensify dialogue with South Africa that led to an exchange of high-level visits. And so also pressure measures such as the possible suspension of South Africa's participation in the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. We see efforts by the United Kingdom, the European Union to influence the South African foreign policy. Individual countries that are not burdened by a legacy of colonialism seem to be able to make their voices heard better. But the recent visit by the president of Finland shows otherwise. As President Niinistö said, he was listened to carefully and perhaps understood. But after more than 1 hour of conversation, President Ramaphosa's position has not changed. I also find it telling that after the long phone conversation between President Zelensky and Ramaphosa, only brief reports of the fact itself were published, without any comments on the content and outcome of the conversation. In fact, that means that no result was achieved. And Ukraine is very well aware that it needs to strengthen its presence in Africa. But I note that despite considerable diplomatic efforts, the impact of the ruling party and government in South Africa is weak. But despite the desperate situation, efforts must be made to convince decision makers by emphasizing Russia's voice against Ukraine is expansionist, neo-colonialist, imperialist, and breaking with the established world order and international law, and by refuting the popular narrative that this was a proxy war between West and Russia. So, in short term, let's say until 2024 elections, we cannot expect change in the position of South Africa, unless Ukraine is victorious by then and Russia is defeated. Then South Africa would have to rethink its positions, whether to remain on the side of the defeated aggressor and on the wrong side of history, or to admit its mistake. The next piece of puzzle for South Africa is the BRICS summit in August. I assume, however, that Putin will not attend in person, even though this would mean both humiliating Putin and acknowledging that South Africa is supporting a war criminal. The implications of other decisions for South Africa would be much worse. I would not take the South Africa's votes at the UN very tragically. The South African Republic now abstains on UN resolutions condemning Russia, but there was a time when it voted against. So we have even seeing some improvement in that respect. And you know that other BRICS countries like India and Brazil are also voting similarly. So about futures, as I said, there is no chance that of a change in the position of the current South African leadership. Will the elections of 2024 bring change? Political analysts are much more pessimistic than a few months ago. And more of my interlocutors are putting the time for change back to 2029. Only time will tell. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, the ambassador. I can see that from some faces we have a little now saddish mood, so to say, because you mentioned the words like desperate. But at least I think after all the presentations now there is less surprise from the position of the external, so to say, and from our region observers, what's going on in Africa, because we have more understanding now, especially about South Africa Republic situation. But still, we still have a lot of to discuss, and I want to encourage the participants to ask the questions by raising their hand, or just, as I said, using the question and answer section, chat section. But before there are hands raised, I rushed back to the first speaker, Stephen, and ask once again about the narrative fight in the South African Republic, and will it be as, and would you agree with the ambassador's conclusion that the power game will not change, and until the election happens next year, and the society as such is here desperate, so to say, because indeed it seems that corruption is also one of the key words. And then I would like to go to back to Ray and ask to tell about what we talked before the discussion in our session about the possibility of Putin to come to South Africa and being arrested, and how South Africa will act will mean a lot if he comes. So Steve, please, could you take the floor and go back to the beginning?
Thank you. So I think if you were to have a look at how the Western or the pro-Western or the pro-Ukraine narrative is being built, it's definitely through mainstream media. So international stations like BBC and CNN and Sky News are popular in South Africa, and they are unashamedly portraying the Western view. Although, you know, it's interesting, not in the same sort of way that RT does it. And that's an interesting factor in South Africa, because in March last year, RT was taken off our satellite package and the DSTV bouquet, and there was actually quite an outcry from many people that this voice was not being heard, that it was being stifled, and of course the feed was stopped from Europe because of the sanctions. So RT is actually making efforts to revive itself. There is an office that's opened here in Sandton in Johannesburg. It's a small bureau, but they are putting out programming on the internet on Africa because they don't yet have the infrastructure or the full bureau set up in South Africa. So I think most journalists are not pro-Russia. They try to be objective, but I think most of them will subscribe to the democracy narrative, and so I think that's how the narrative is being put together. I would agree very much with the ambassador that if we see change, it's not going to be before the elections, and we might not see so much change at the elections. I think there's a lot of infighting between opposition parties that prevent them from being a very strong united front against the ANC.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for clarification on your insights. And before I go to Ray, there is a hand raised, so I will invite Konstantinas Andrijauskas, the docent and doctor at our institute who focuses on Asia, especially China, to take a floor and share his comments or ask the question, please.
Thank you very much, Giedre. Can I be seen?
Yes,
Apologies for the back and oh wait, I'll switch on. Full discussion. I actually had one general and one more specific question. The general question is, you know, looking from this side of the globe, right, from Central and Eastern Europe, from Northern Europe, from the global north, you know, when we're hearing about Russia in Africa, it's always about Wagner this and Wagner that. Now, I do comprehend that our topic has much more to do with soft power, but the question is the following: how can you describe the role of the Wagner group at this point? Because apparently they're being thrashed pretty massively in Bakhmut and around. We can witness very serious disagreements between the apparent head of the organization and Russia's leadership. Is Wagner still as active as it used to be, and is Wagner doing things beyond the military? So this would bring us to like the soft power narrative and all. So thank you. And more specific question to Dr. Hartley. On your survey, you know, the results are very fascinating. I mean, they're very surprising that the majority of the respondents in both South Africa and Zimbabwe, that they're supporting this position that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a bad thing, that it should be condemned, if I got it correctly. But then I've got the question about the actual wording. Wouldn't you think that if the wording would be done otherwise, saying that Russia's actions towards Ukraine or Ukraine should be condemned, that the results would be different? Because I would imagine that invasion is a strong word, as it is in our region, in our country, so probably is the case in the global South in general and South Africa in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Konstantini, for joining us, for your contribution to this discussion. As you see, we have interesting colleagues here, participants gathered. So please, who would take the question about the actual activity of the Wagner group, and then the Dr. Ray maybe can answer both questions. I don't know. Oh, you're muted, Ray.
Sorry, the old mute problem. Yeah, I can have a go at that. I mean, I think that, you know, in Africa, Wagner's expending very few resources for quite a high outcome. So there's not tens of thousands of Wagner troops here. So they're in countries like Mali, Libya, Central African Republic, Sudan, where there are fragile regimes. Some of them come to power through coups and so on, that require some kind of, really, they just need a sort of private security firm to help them out because they're under attack. And the exchange for that is that Wagner gets access to minerals and starts concluding all of these business contracts, which makes it extremely wealthy. So there's, I think, you know, if anything, they're probably more in need of Africa. It is the source, really, of a lot of their wealth, the money that they use to power their organization. And I think that if they're politically ambitious, as the head of Wagner seems to be, he probably wants that war chest. And as I say, it's not costing them a lot of troops. They also might struggle to get those troops to agree to go to Ukraine. You know, the outcomes have been rather unpleasant there. So I would just leave it at that. I think, let me just correct, I'm not doctor. Unfortunately, my colleagues are proper analysts. I'm just an amateur. You know, on the question of Putin coming to South Africa in August. So without wanting to take up too much time, there's quite important history there, because the Sudanese leader, Omar al-Bashir, visited South Africa a couple of years back. In fact, it was more than that, while there was an arrest warrant out for him from the ICC. The South Africans failed to arrest him, and there was a lot of sort of confusion, and the plane left, and you know, did the South Africans help him get away and all that kind of thing. But quite importantly, there was then a court case brought, and South Africa's High Court ruled that South Africa was obliged, in terms of its concession to the Rome Statutes and the undertakings in its ICC membership, to have arrested Omar al-Bashir. So we have some quite strong law on the books by way of precedent, that if a head of state visits South Africa and there is an arrest warrant, we are compelled by law to arrest him. We also have a very active NGO network in South Africa, including those who brought that original case. And I have no doubt that the second he sets foot in South Africa, there will be urgent interdicts and cases brought before the courts to compel the South African government to arrest him. They might choose still not to do so, and to rather suffer the embarrassment of, ignoring a court order, than contradict their Russian friends. So that's the situation. As to whether or not Putin will actually come in August, I think that really depends on what happens in Ukraine. He may or may not be in a politically more precarious position in August. I'm not sure. It's very hard to say what the situation will be in August. I just wanted to also say one thing on a previous comment that was made that mentioned Libya. South Africa voted in favor of the resolution leading to the intervention in Libya. It's just something that should be remembered. They then subsequently, after President Zuma, met with the Russians in Sochi. They then walked it back and said NATO was overreaching and not sticking to the terms of the resolution, etc., etc. But it was quite an interesting illustration, really, of how Russia disagrees with an action and then exerts influence. And I think the same thing happened with Ukraine. So the initial statement from DIRCO, our Department of International Relations and Cooperation, was pretty unequivocal, condemning the invasion and saying even Russia should withdraw. And then subsequent to that, they walked it back. And I imagine that they were responding to similar pressure from Russia.
Thank you very much, Ray. I hope you do not hesitate that I will join the company of not being a doctor and hardly will ever be, but still enjoying the presence in such a discussions, and especially because we have very diverse panel here. Civil society is present, the diplomatic sector is present, academia, and yes, all the students who are here, I want to encourage you also to talk and to raise your hands, and the rest of the participants. But to add to the topic of the Wagner and the groups, I want to cite the Nigerian president who spoke on the topic, and he said the longer this war goes on, the more it opens up for all manners of groups to be entangled with, if not directly through financial and funding, through building solidarity and the rest, the more that becomes a possibility, the more insurgent groups in the Sahel begin to find that a theater of war in Ukraine as a veritable source, meaning that it can be it seems to be a long-lasting war in Ukraine, which will have different aspects that will be more visible later, perhaps. But for now, I want to ask whoever would take this question. It was the idea how this the importance of South Africa position in the international relations realm, how potentially it can affect other African countries. Does it affect, and can you speak a little bit more about a diversity of African state situations and the perceptions in the different nations? Steve, I see you could you take the question?
I was busy twitching, so yes, I'm happy to take the question. Look, I think South Africa still matters in international relations. I think we had a period when those relations were quite damaged under President Zuma. People talk about the lost decade. I think the stories of corruption and state capture that have come out have shocked people, and also, unfortunately, we had a number of incidences of xenophobic violence in South Africa, where African nationals have been targeted and attacked and killed in some instances, and that's, I think, affected South Africa's relations with other African countries. It's not so I think it's complex. It's not that South Africa is a self-appointed leader. It's sometimes been described as a reluctant hegemon, a country that tries to lead by consensus and from behind rather than in front. I think if you see look at the role that South Africa plays in SADC, in the Southern African Development Community, and you compare that to the very dominant role that Nigeria plays in the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, South Africa is a little bit more tentative. But nevertheless, even with damage to its foreign policy and its foreign image, it still is a country that punches above its weight diplomatically and still matters. In terms of influence, I think what's interesting is to look at how the other countries that were delivered from colonialism through wars and through anti-colonial movements, through liberation movements, have had very similar voting patterns to South Africa. So Namibia has abstained on most, but I don't think all of the UN resolutions. Angola has abstained. Zimbabwe has abstained. Mozambique has abstained, not on all of them as well. So it's very interesting to look at the differences. But as Ray said, you know, all three countries sitting on the UN Security Council, Gabon, Ghana, and Kenya at the time, were very outspoken against violations of the UN Charter. So there are a mixture of opinions. Sometimes there's small states that you wouldn't expect to vote one way or another. But South Africa, I don't think is in a position to pick up the phone and say, vote like this. While it's recognized as a leader, it's not always comfortable in that position.
Thank you very much. And I see that Inga Stankaite, the second secretary of the embassy, is raising her hand. So maybe here I can also pose the question, and maybe Inga could take it, because it's addressed also to the diplomatic mission. Lucas has spoken and identified some narratives that can be found in Baltic states public opinion, so to say, and one of it is that Africa is itself no agency, and basically is the arena of the influences of other big powers. And on the other hand, we have this flagman or leadership role as Lithuania to bring in the awareness of Russian imperialism, the aggressiveness, and to learn from the history. And as Ray said, Russia is not the same now, and South Africa is not the same, but at the same time, our narrative says often that Russia is the same and doesn't change in essence. So Inga, when you take the question, could you also refer to the mission of embassy or diplomatic mission when what comes to the action, yes, about the kind of active message sending and activities that would help to kind of take this swinging state, as somebody says, to the side of a to the pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western orientation, please.
Thank you, Giedre. Thank you for all the panelists. A very inspiring, I'd say, and interesting discussion, and maybe eye-opening for many Lithuanian listeners as well. So I wanted also to pose a question. So maybe I'll start from a short comment and then a question, and then I'll try to answer the question what the embassy is doing to reach out and to explain more the Lithuanian position, and let's say, in a wider sense, Baltic and Central and Eastern European position. So for me personally, working at the embassy here in South Africa, what strikes me most, I'd say, how different we perceive the situation, how different we as Lithuanians understand the conflict, or let's say active Russia's aggression towards Ukraine, and how, I mean, for us in Lithuania, a neighboring huge country, Russia, attacked Ukraine, and Ukrainians are defending themselves with the help of NATO and the Western partners. This is the way we see it, to put it very simply. But so from what I hear, let's say from the governing party, the ANC officials, also those who are like architects of the South African foreign policy positions, and a lot of, let's say, analysts, the way they see it, they take the agency of Ukraine. It's very rare that you would hear, let's say, the voice of the Ukrainian ambassador, or I'm not speaking even of the foreign minister of Ukraine, or even the President Zelensky, being directly in contact with the South African government and explaining his position. So there are various reasons, I guess, to that. But the way a lot of people see the conflict is it's a Russia-NATO conflict. So basically, NATO encroached Russia, and now, you know, there's no Ukraine in the narrative, not so much of Ukraine in the narrative. It's NATO who is like attacking Russia, basically. So for me, it's something that maybe we should be thinking in terms of, so what the Western, or let's say the Northern Hemisphere countries have done to like, let's say, to counter that narrative, and what NATO as an organization and NATO members have done to also to somehow shape or influence the views or the narrative of the South African government as well as other African governments. So there is a vacuum here. You hear a lot of Russia. So Russia is organizing, let's say, Russian-African summit. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov is coming directly to South Africa, meeting the highest officials and channeling directly their views and the way they see the situation. And the South Africans are very they accept that view much much more easier than they would accept any, let's say, Swedish or Finnish president coming in and explaining their own position, where they come from, you know, why they just joined NATO and what type of organization is NATO. So this is maybe one thing to think about. So now what Lithuanian embassy is doing, I guess ambassador would also be in a good position to respond to that, but since we are working in tandem together here at the embassy, so of course we're reaching out to the officials. Not that easy, I should say as well. Lithuania is a small country, not that easy to get through to the officials and to the policymakers. So, and also you come, you speak, you have a dialogue, because we also have formal dialogues like political consultations, so which were organized a little bit more than half a year ago, where the deputy minister of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, Alvin Botas, was visiting Lithuania. So he also had the contacts with our vice minister and with the highest officials. And I cannot say that there is some sort of, I would still maybe try and have faith in it, in a sense that everyone is a human being. So whatever you hear, it somehow sets into your mind, and you might have small shifts after a lot of times that you heard some alternative to your own, narrative. So I'd say it makes sense. It makes sense to reach out and to keep telling. And maybe one of the initiatives that we are planning here at the embassy with SAIA as well, like the Institute of International Relations of South Africa that Stephen Grust represents. We haven't made any practical arrangements yet, but we have an idea to organize a discussion, maybe more a physical discussion here in Pretoria, where we would like to invite the Lithuanian historians and analysts who could explain more of our experience and where we come from and why we see Russia the way we see, and the threat from our neighbor. So that would be my contribution.
Thank you, Inga. Thank you very much for your intervention. I was looking forward for such voice who would actually put some dots on E, saying, what's going on, what's the difference between. As I initiated this discussion, actually with Inga, we talked that there are differences, and for me, as even African studies enthusiast and so teacher, I am so still lacking the feeling. Oh, why and what is going on in South Africa, in the region, behind the scenes, and these narratives. The difference, as I said, are if not shocking, then surprising, because we so much live in our own narrative. If you open the tabloids, the media, we are just for 1 year, we are living in number one title, number one news. It's Ukraine defense on the Russian aggression, and all the biggest news are so far from there. And I know when I speak to the people from different parts of the world that we are now really centered, and we kind of here in the Northern Pole, we don't see other conflicts, of course, naturally going on in the world as sensitive as we have now in the so to say neighborhood. But that also has to do with the big scene of geopolitical powers, and there can be some shifts, right? People talk now, specialists talk about predicted Russia fail in some future, and the new order with China emerging, and here different aspects can come back to the discussion in China again. But we are about to round up or go back to the last comments, and I would like to ask if colleagues, Ambassador Lucas, have or Stephen or Ray have some more comments to each other or about what was said. If not, I think. Yes, please. Yes.
Because Ray has been raising hand. So should
Go ahead, Lucas.
I'm just like thinking about wrapping up. I think as a reflective practitioner, the person or organization that works in the field, besides those geopolitical, analytical work that will give us overview from the high point of view, is one thing. Another thing is what Inga said, that we need to work. And I think that's also our academics' responsibility to go and talk with our African, like within this more broader media, of our own position, how we perceive the conflict, how we perceive the war. One example is our member of European Parliament, Rasa Yuknevičiūtė, who gives interviews to Al Jazeera, to India news channels, in order to talk, to be present, not to let Westerners still talking about the conflict, what is happening within Baltics, within Eastern and Central Europe, in Ukraine, like they would be an experts of that region. So we need to be vocal. It's also like a structural problem, but we have to have a courage to do so. though I know that we focused on South Africa, but what I want to just acknowledge that our Ministry of Foreign Affairs are working on with our other African counterparts as Nigeria, Kenya, Namibia. We had a forum of small and medium democracies last year organized by Vice Minister Mantas Odomenas, where we as a country try to be a democracy hub, defending democracies and gathering democracies all around the world. So we are active in, talking with like-minded countries as Ghana, Nigeria. We have an ambassador here in Vilnius of Nigeria. So we need to take, all the networks that we have, all the opportunities to talk and have this conversation, not to impose our own views, but to have a genuine talk. That I would say it's important to keep in mind, not to impose our own views, because we have different, like for example, Soviet Union role in the colonization process. It could not be denied, but then we need to have a conversation of different experiences, and that conversation has to be done by different kinds of actors. We as civil society organizations are doing through our own networks. And I think we need to work on very practical, even it's small, but we need to make a difference. We know there is different CE experts, for example, Labuda, who's Polish, working in Senegal. He's organizing their discussions. So we could, connect our efforts to bring our voices there. So this is, let's, yes, analysis, it's good, reports are good, and then try to think out how to make them into practical actions. I think that's very important. It should be kept in mind after these discussions.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for reminding and calling for the action. And Ray, you wanted to add the last comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the agency thing because I think it's very important. I think Africa has growing agency, but Africa is poorly organized to take advantage of that. So it has growing agency in two major areas. The first is African demographics. It's the youthful continent. The youth is the future. This is where there is a large reservoir of youth, where global supply chains will be looking to Africa in future for manufacturing and for stuff that can't be done in countries with contracting, aging populations. The second is the mineral resources, and more specifically, those mineral resources that are required for the global reset on energy, especially around renewables, talking about copper and the rare earths and all the others that are needed for these batteries and so on, where Africa has incredible resources. But Africa is very poorly organized to make the most of that. The governments are fractured. We give ourselves away cheaply. Wagner comes along and gives you security as a president, and you give them your mines. So Africa needs to become more organized and more thoughtful about how easily it gives away its sovereignty and its loyalty in exchange for what. So that would be my remark on the agency. I also think on the question of the way that the world perceives the conflict, I think it's also, the West and NATO are also to blame here, because they project it as a conflict between the West and NATO. So it's always Western values are under threat. We in the West must act to defend ourselves. After Ukraine comes Poland, and then it's, Europe is under threat. So to people living in the South or the East, the West being under threat is meaningless. I mean, it's just sort of, it's not a direct, there's no connection made between the impact of this invasion on countries around the world. So any countries that are trying to grow, integrate with the world, be part of a functional multilateral system, have democracy and accountability and openness, are threatened by the Ukraine invasion, not just countries of the West. And if I was them, I would start projecting this conflict differently as a threat to global democracy around the planet, as a threat to all countries that hold these values, these political values dear. So that's just my comment on the narrative side of it.
Ray, thank you very much. This is a really strong statement, which I kind of feel that we could have a follow-up directly talking about the democratic state in the world of the democracies. And actually, this narrative change might be the key in gathering maybe some support, or because not all pragmatical reasons are there, as Stephen emphasized. And we have a couple minutes left, and there is one question of actually two questions now from participants, and I want to voice them. And the first one would really go to, I would like you, Stephen, to take it, if you don't mind. Hello. Thank you for this interesting discussion. I have a question. How does Jewish diaspora in South Africa Republic see Russia's war against Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm a member of that community, so hopefully I can talk with some authority. And as many of you probably know, about 80 to 90% of South Africa's Jewish community came out here from Lithuania between the 1860s and the Second World War. So I think about 40,000 Jews left from Lithuania. I think judging, I also do some writing for our local Jewish newspaper, the South African Jewish Report. My sense is that most South African Jews are very supportive of Ukraine, are very critical of Russia, and that's the mainstream position. It's probably similar in most of the white community, I would say. I don't know if Ray would have a difference of opinion, but I think the Jewish community would be in step with Ukraine and is very supportive of Ukraine. Work has been done to provide resources and charitable support for Ukraine. So that would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I will read the comment, actually, not a question of a participant. Russia's non-colonial past was mentioned in discussion. I usually have very lovely discussions with colleagues at international organizations about Russia's role in East and Central Europe since the 17th century, and the aha moment when I convinced that none of Baltic and other states joined Soviet Union willingly, that it was occupation, colonization, question mark. One way to go, check and revise history books and other popular literature that Africa countries get fooled with Russian history perspective. Amazing how facts and history can be interpreted. See, this is the suggestion or comment that can be taken into account. And here we are at the end of the discussion, and I really want to agree with that we shouldn't stop with this discussion. And one thing I can do, and I will do, I know that already it's agreed on 25th of May and on the Lithuanian National Radio, I will talk about this topic. And dear colleagues, if you don't mind, I will use some of your thoughts just to inform Lithuanian radio listeners about what is going on and what is behind the positions of African states and nations due to the Russian war in Ukraine. I thank you all very, very much for being present, for sharing your thoughts and insights, because it's very important to have mutual understanding and actually awareness. And just in this way, we can find some solutions and support each other in the ways which will matter for us and for our children and other generations. So I will just say thank you once again to the Ambassador of Lithuania in South Africa Republic for this facilitation, because as Inga said, it's not so easy to reach out to each other when you are not on the ground. But at the same time, as I said already, we are always open to discuss and share the perspective from Baltic states. If ever the interest or need would be, we would be happy to contribute and cooperate in the future. So thank you all very much. And if you would like to say last words, you are welcome. If not, when we will see each other on other occasions. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.